Two eco-heroes of mine, and we just heard from Joy, and it's my pleasure to introduce Andrea Pickard. She is an ecologist at Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge. She specializes in studying coastal ecology and restoration, vegetation ecology, endangered plants, and she is a dear friend and mentor of mine, as well as a very handy colleague. So, thanks, Andrea, for coming.
Okay, so part of the point of my talk is that it's no coincidence that you just heard from all salt marsh people, and now I'm going to talk about dunes. So what was that, 4-1? First of all, I want to start out by acknowledging my collaborators who've been really important. And this one here, Patrick Hesp, is from Australia, so he suffers from sun deprivation when he visits the foggy North Coast. Laura Goldsmith, she has no excuse because she lives there. And then Connor Shea is an engineer with the Arcata Field Office Coastal Program up in Humboldt. And like I said, he's an engineer, so you won't find him lying down on the job. And lastly, the rest of our really terrific crew at Lamphere. So I'm going to be talking about coastal dunes and sea level rise. And as you've been hearing all morning, that there are lots of models that are addressing sea level rise on estuaries. And ironically enough, many of those estuaries depend on barrier dune systems to protect them. So really it's time that dunes took a little more of the spotlight. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot of geomorphic terms. I'm not a geomorphologist, but one of my collaborators is. But I do want to reassure everyone that this talk is about plants. So I'm going to start with a definition of foredunes. Okay, so foredunes are shore parallel ridges, and they're really important because they are right at the boundary of the continental and oceanic zones, and they front the dune system. And they're unique in that most dune forms are oriented with respect to predominant wind rather than parallel to the shoreline, so they play kind of an outsized role. And so my talk today will focus on the foredune. So with the little bit of work that has been done, most of which has been modeling without a lot of empirical data, it's proposed that there are three general possible responses of foredunes to sea level rise. So the least likely would be where you actually get growth of the foredune out towards the coast. Now this might be possible on, for example, uplifting coasts with really high sediment supply, but Humboldt Bay, we're on a subsiding basin with a higher than state average sea level rise, so not going to happen for us. Two other possibilities. One would occur under a negative sediment budget, which just means that you have more sediment leaving the foredune than is coming into the foredune. And in this situation, the foredune morphology can't be maintained. The foredune destabilizes, the dune field can mobilize and transgress, and basically run over both built and natural landscapes, so probably not your first choice. Thirdly, and optimistically, it's posed that with a positive or neutral sand budget, the foredune can gradually retreat through this process referred to as rollover or translation, where sand is gradually moving both up in elevation as it moves inland. So I'm going to be discussing two different types of foredunes today. One is called an incipient foredune, and by definition, it's a developing foredune. They are generally ephemeral. They can last 1 year or several years, maybe a decade, but, and then occasionally they do transition into established foredunes. Established foredunes tend to be much higher and wider and have more permanence, more topographic heterogeneity, and of course more vegetation diversity. So, what's a foredune, since you're all botanists? And yes, I am going to get to the plants. A foredune is a sand-sharing system with the beach. So it's really pretty simple. Each component, the beach and the dune, episodically stores and releases sand. So it's exchanging sediment. And the Foredune sediment budget, which I've mentioned already, is a way of quantifying this exchange, both the exchange and the losses out of the system, both landward and seaward. So I wanted to take you through an erosional, or actually a depositional cycle in a foredune. And the one that I'm showing is a little bit more than your average erosional event. This is one that you would expect more during, say, an El Nino, significant El Nino year, when you already have elevated sea levels, and then you get a storm surge on top of that, and the water's able to reach right into the base of the dune and do some real damage. So first, you start with a major scarping event, and then you have a cliffed foredune. So when the foredune's cliffed and it's this big vertical face, there's really no opportunity for sand from the beach to get up to the top of the foredune. So that's a gradual process that's happening both by the slumping of sand off the foredune cliff, but also sand accreting up at the base of the foredune. And that process, as the sand reaches the top of the foredune again, is known as a foredune ramp. Once that occurs, you can get vegetation colonizing from the top of the foredune down onto the face. And then with a continued kind of quiescent weather period, you get the formation of an incipient, or you can get the formation of an incipient foredune. And then you're back at the original. This could be maintained, or this could go next into a major erosional cycle. So you can see that dune systems are really variable and complex. They're responding to these seasonal, annual, and long period oceanic cycles like El Nino and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So they're really hard to model, but they're also responding to vegetation. Vegetation plays a really big role in foredunes. So going into this study, we recognized the need for data that integrates vegetation and geomorphic processes so that we can develop and calibrate models and start to predict some dune responses to sea level rise. Now, the sand transport operates at the scale of a littoral cell. A littoral cell is just a compartment in which you have sand transport as well as sources and sinks. And our project is located on the Eureka Littoral Cell, which is about a 64-kilometer cell located off of Humboldt Bay and the Eel River. And that's a really large area, so we are starting very simple with the area just off Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge's Lanphier and Malel Dunes units. And we're starting with this very simple hypothesis, because really the whole effort here is to develop more sophisticated hypotheses. But we started with this hypothesis that sand is transported and deposited differently within 3 dominant vegetation types found on the dunes. See vegetation.
We were worried.
Yeah, I know. So here's the vegetation part, so get ready. Ammophila, there's 3 alliances. Ammophila arenaria, the semi-natural alliance, which is dominated by invasive Ammophila or European beach grass. The LMS, also known as Lamus Mollis Alliance, which is our native dune building grass on the west coast, and grows it has a wider bladed leaf and grows less densely. And then we have this alliance called DUNE MAT. I won't even read the long name. This is a community of herbaceous to suffrutescent perennials and annuals. That does include some grasses, but they're not as tall as the dune building grasses. So those were the three communities we plan to examine in terms of sea level rise response. So our methods were to place 14 transects along the stretch of property that we own and manage, parallel with the prevailing wind. We did encompass 3 different sites with different dune restoration histories, and 3 vegetation types, as I've mentioned, and 2 blowout types. But for what I'm talking about today, we're, and our transects extend from about mean high water inland up to about 400 meters. And today I'm just going to be restricting the results to the transects located in the landfear and the adjoining parcel to the north that has not yet been restored. So we're fortunate to have this really great equipment that the coastal program at the Fish and Wildlife Service makes available to us, as well as this terrific engineer they make available to us, Connor Shea. And we walk along those transects carrying these rover units, and this one is being carried by Laurel Goldsmith, one of the co-authors here. And she's basically navigating to preloaded stations that are meter apart and taking topographic measurements. And then once the topographic measurement is recorded, a pin flag is placed in order to mark the spot for the vegetation sampling that comes after, because it's slower. And we do veg sampling every 4 meters in the more inland part of the dunes and every other meter as you get towards the Foredune. And I'm not going to go into detail on the data collection for plants, because I'm talking about plants at the level of vegetation, not individual species, but we do have a lot of really detailed information that will be available for a lot of other analyses. So before I go into the results, I do feel like one more time I have to take you through a little bit of the jargon. So I already mentioned this is a typical Foredune profile. I mentioned the incipient Foredune, which is just above and on top of the backshore. And then the face, I was calling it the dune face, is actually the stoss slope. And there's we divided it into lower and upper stoss slope. And then the top of the dune is the crest, and over the crest is a swale referred to as the Foredune swale. So these are the zones that we chose to examine our deposition within, and we actually combined these last 2 zones because they're kind of the most significant for what we're interested in. So yes, the response variables change in elevation from summer 2012 to summer 2014 by topographic zone and vegetation type. And the relevance of all this is, if we want our foredunes to translate, we need sand to be able to get up and over the Foredune. So these are the results. I'm going to go from the bottom of the Foredune up to the top. This is the incipient Foredune, and this one is a little skewed because we had a large scarping event in the DUNE MAT area. This is also a really disturbed part of the profile, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that other than to say the significant differences were between DUNE MAT and LMS. But also to point out that this is the zone we found the well-formed incipient Foredune morphology in, and that's relevant because it does, an incipient Foredune does create a buffer for incoming waves that will absorb the wave energy before it reaches the established Foredune. So then we go up to the lower stoss slope, and you can see that, boom, this is the first zone that Ammophila is actually growing in, and so in the Ammophila profile, a whole bunch of the sediment is dumped out at this zone. And that's the only significant zone that differs in the amount of deposition there, or the significant strata. And then as you go to the upper stoss slope, well, the sediment has just dropped out of the Ammophila now. It was all trapped down there in the lower zone, but you're seeing some significant deposition up at the upper stoss slope of DUNE MAT. And then as we go over into the crest and swale, again, the only statistically significant stratum was the DUNE MAT stratum. So our preliminary conclusions, and I want to remind everyone that this is based on a very small sample size, and B, a temporally small sample size, which encompasses a depositional phase of the Foredune cycle. So, but we were able to determine that deposition in each zone did differ by dominant vegetation. And to summarize, Ammophila had the most deposition at the lower stoss phase. It didn't develop an incipient foredune, which can be a buffer from low scarping and allows for quicker recovery from storms, which is a form of resilience. Yet there was little to no translation, so I call that poor adaptation potential. The Elemis zone had the strongest incipient foredune to absorb moderately high wave energy, which is good, but the lowest overall deposition and no translation. So I call that incomplete adaptation potential. And finally, DUNE MAT, which had the highest overall deposition, which was concentrated in the upper parts of the foredune and went beyond the crest, but had no incipient foredune protection, is yet again an incomplete adaptation, has incomplete adaptation potential. So kind of the take-home message here is that all the native dune vegetation has an important role with respect to sea level rise. So again, Elemis, more resistance and quicker recovery from storms. DUNE MAT, good for gradual translation. And we now want to take a study, well, we're continuing those plots, but we'd like to expand our study over a larger geographic area so that we can, first of all, the alongshore gradients can be really important. We want to be able to separate out those effects. And secondly, we're poised now to do some controlled experiments manipulating the vegetation, in particular the position and the composition of the Elemis and DUNE MAT vegetation types as a way of increasing the transport of sand over the foredune while keeping some resilience. And then just to show you that my workers really do work hard, here they are out in the rain. And I wanted to thank these particular people who weren't mentioned at the beginning, some of the folks that have been out there for 3 years. I think I didn't mention that we do this twice a year to get seasonal changes, so twice a year for a few weeks a year out in the weather. So thank you. Right.